And I, just so you know, I always call in on the phone because sometimes my internet cuts out. It should be fine, but if anything does happen, I still have the phone connection. So I'll just keep talking and then I'll be able to pull it back up if there is any interruption.
Great. Well, we have a lot of folks jumping on. We'll, for those of you who are joining us, we'll wait a few minutes for everyone to log in here, and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining tonight. Kary, is it still raining in Salt Lake?
You know, it's not snowing. It was definitely, well, I'm in Park City, but it's close enough.
Park City, yep.
It was full on snowing yesterday, but today it's been drizzling on and off.
It just started here, which is good to see. So,
yeah,
nice.
well, as we were saying, we all need the precepts, so I guess we'll have to take it. I am excited for the bike trails to dry up, though. That's always good.
Yeah, we were actually in Salt Lake last weekend briefly and got a ride down in Salt Lake, and trails were pretty dry down there by the U.
Oh, were you up in the foothills?
Yeah, it was nice. There was a lot of people riding. It was pretty impressive to see how many people were out. It was a nice day.
Yeah, well, especially now in the shoulder season when the higher elevation trails are not dry, it just pushes everyone down to those trails. But yeah, they've been dry pretty low.
Yeah, they've really built those out too. There's quite a few new trails there. It was fun to see.
Yeah, they've been building trails everywhere, it seems. I don't know if you've ridden Park City recently, but it keeps expanding, which is good.
Well, to those who are jumping on here, I'll just wait another minute or two for a few more to filter on. Here we have a great audience tonight, and then I'll do a quick introduction and get started. Thanks for joining. Well, in the interest of time, I think I will get started. I'm Winter Sports Club Athletic Director Dave Stewart, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Kary Woodruff, who'll be talking to us about the importance of adequate nutrition for performance and health, and Luke Brosserhouse from Winter Sports Club, who'll be facilitating the conversation from the sports performance perspective. Kary Woodruff is the Director of Sports Nutrition Master's Program at the University of Utah and a lecturer in Utah's Nutrition Integrative Psychology Department. Kary's a lecturer and published author in the areas of sports nutrition, eating disorder prevention and treatment, women's health and nutrition, and healthy weight for life. The presentation for us tonight will focus on the importance of adequate fueling for both health and performance, establishing a healthy relationship with food, and how coaches, athletes, and parents can be prepared to address energy imbalance in athletes. For those of you who don't know Luke Brosserhouse is the Winter Sports Club mental strength coach, working primarily with our high school age programs through his mental strength performance program. Luke also holds a master's degree in exercise and sports science, from the University of Utah in the area of sports psychology, and has worked with the Winter Sports Club both in his current role and as a coach, and is also the general manager out at Catamount Ranch Golf Course. For a little background on this presentation, we offered a couple valuable presentations this past fall on sports nutrition and relative energy deficiency in athletes, but I felt we had neglected the really important aspect of the risk of energy imbalance and how we can support a healthy relationship with food as athletes, coaches, and parents. And Luke was kind enough to connect us to Kary Woodruff here. For tonight, Kary and Luke will present for about 45 minutes, and then we reserved about 30 minutes after that for discussion and question and answer. If you have questions, please just raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can type your question directly into the chat. And Kary, Luke, and myself can read those as well. This presentation will be recorded for later viewing. And without listening to me talk anymore, I will let Kary get it started. Kary, thanks so much for finding the time for this, and to Luke as well, and I'll let you get started.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I'm happy and honored to be here, and I love the fact that there is a whole club that is prioritizing this topic. I think that it is one that can easily get missed, and as a registered dietitian who works with athletes who end up developing disordered eating and eating disorders, and as we'll see tonight, it can be easy to see how subtle and quickly, though, that these habits can form. And so catching it earlier on typically results in much better outcomes. And so I think it's just really helpful to talk about how are we helping our athletes not only to fuel themselves sufficiently to make sure that they're getting enough energy, enough nutrients, but also to make sure that from a lifelong development standpoint, that we're supporting the development of a healthy relationship with food and nutrition and their bodies. Okay, so here are some action points that I would love to discuss tonight as an overview. So we'll be talking about a quick review of sport nutrition. We'll talk about what does it look like to be consuming enough energy. We'll look at what happens when athletes don't fuel enough, why that may happen, what are the risk factors for that, and then what do we do about that in those circumstances. And then, as Dave mentioned, we will open up some time at the end for questions. I did a undergrad degree in psychology, and then I did a master's in sports psychology with Luke at the University of Utah, where I was fortunate enough to meet him, and that's how we got connected and how I became introduced to your Winter Sports Club. And then I went on and did another graduate program in sport nutrition, and I recently finished my PhD in nutrition and integrative physiology. I still get to work one day a week as a sports dietitian at a Live Well Center here in Utah, part of Intermountain Healthcare, a large healthcare organization in Utah, where I do specialize in the treatment of athletes with eating disorders. I'm a registered dietitian with the USOPC, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and so I do oftentimes work with local athletes, Olympic athletes that may have some disordered eating. And then I have two little girls, and we enjoy being in the outside as well. My background is as a freestyle skier, so I'm sad to say that I never quite was good enough to be a competitive Nordic skier. Though in college, I had a roommate who had been in the 2006 Olympics for Nordic skiing, and she taught me a lot about the training demands of Nordic skiers. So I've learned a little vicariously, and then I enjoy Nordic skiing on my own just for fun. So this should ideally be much of a review. I've had the opportunity to view some of the presentations that you received in the fall, and so this is all what I surmise to be pretty consistent with what you covered in the fall. I just think it's sometimes helpful to review these concepts if it's been a little while since we talked about them. So when we think about the athlete's plate, we like to make sure that we're focusing on a wide variety of nutrients, both macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and then the micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, right? So I sort of break sport nutrition into four categories. We have carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and hydration fluids. So carbohydrates, oftentimes when I ask individuals what do they think about carbohydrates, we oftentimes think about grains, which are great sources of complex carbohydrates. It includes fruits and especially starchy vegetables, peas, corn, potatoes, winter squashes, and milk and yogurt have some carbohydrate. And then sport nutrition products can sometimes end up comprising a large component of an athlete's carbohydrate intake. We then have protein, and it's not uncommon for an athlete to overestimate the amount of protein that they might need, though some athletes might underestimate it. But protein is essential for building muscle, for tissue repair, for our immune system. It's essential for hydration balance, fluid balance within the body. So it has a lot of functions in addition to muscle building. You see lots of animal sources in addition to plant sources. If an athlete is vegetarian, they can certainly meet their protein needs from plant-based sources like soy, beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds. If an athlete's not a vegetarian, I still encourage them to include plant-based sources just because in addition to the animal sources, it includes a wide variety of nutrients for the athlete's diet. Fats, so we like to focus on healthier sources of fats, avocado, healthy plant-based oils, olive oil, great source of healthy fat, nuts, seeds. And then we also will get some fats from dairy products and from higher fat meats and from baked goods. So we like to focus on the healthier fats, but certainly recognizing that we can get fats from other sources as well. And then fluids. So I remind athletes that all fluids that we consume will contribute to our fluid intake. And so, you know, we won't get into the nuances of fluids, but, and even to appreciate that while about 80% of our daily water intake does come from the beverages that we drink, about 20% will also come from foods such as soups and high water-based foods like fruits and vegetables. So just to review, what we should be eating. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about how much should an athlete be eating. And this is a question that I receive all of the time. And the short answer is, well, I don't know, because it really depends upon a myriad of factors, right? So when I meet with an athlete, I have to take into consideration their age, their height, their weight, their sex, and then we look at their training factors. So how often are they training? How hard are they training? What cycle of training are they in? Are they in a building phase? Are they in a maintenance phase and competition season? So there are a lot of factors that determine our overall energy as well as protein, carbohydrate needs, for example, and it's very individualized. Even environmental factors, so at higher altitudes, like where a lot of your athletes are training, that can increase our energy needs slightly. So there are other environmental factors that impact our nutrient needs. So it is highly individualized. And if you are curious to know more of what your individual calorie and protein, carbohydrate, et cetera, what your individual needs are, that could be a great opportunity to meet with a sports dietitian to see what that would look like. That being said, I still think it can be this vague concept to think about the wide range of nutrients that an athlete might need, right? So it could range if we have, you know, a 12-year-old female athlete compared to the needs of a 17-year-old male athlete, those energy needs, or when I say energy, that's synonymous with calorie, but the energy needs can almost double. Same thing with protein, same thing with carbohydrate. And so this just demonstrates what a wide range nutrient needs can be. I still think it's helpful to have a little bit of a general sense of what this looks like in terms of food, right? So for that athlete who is, here we have a 14-year-old male, just hypothetically. So let's say he's 5'9", 155 pounds, and will be training for about 6 to 10 hours a week, 5 to 6 days a week. So this would be a sufficient intake to provide that athlete with around 2,800 calories. That could be broken down into 3 600-calorie meals and 3 300-calorie snacks. And that would also provide around 100 grams of protein to meet that athlete's needs. So again, just very generalized, but I think to say, well, an athlete needs, you know, 3,000 calories is sometimes hard to conceptualize just how much food that is. And when we're talking with athletes, you know, at the very minimum, athletes should be consuming 3 meals a day and 3 snacks. There certainly can be variations on this, but that's one approach to help to ensure consistent intake throughout the day. And here's examples of meals that are going to be somewhat balanced and provide sufficient nutrients. Here's a scenario of a female, so a 16-year-old female, 5'4", 125 pounds, training for about the same volume each week. And so this would be an energy intake of approximately 2,200 calories. So that would be around 500 calorie meals with 3 250 calorie snacks a day. And it would provide around 85 grams of protein. It's going to provide around 300 grams of carbohydrate. So again, just to try and show in terms of actual food, what this might look like, certainly doesn't mean this is exactly what an athlete needs to eat, but shows quantity-wise what that should look like. So just to kind of give a general sense. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know if our athletes are getting enough, right? Because it can be tricky. We know there's significant variation in day-to-day intake, schedules change, lots of factors can change our intake. And so I might do a 24-hour recall on a patient to see what they ate the previous day, but that may not at all be representative of what they tend to eat on a typical basis. So there are some signs and symptoms that we can look for just to get a general sense of whether or not that athlete is consuming enough on a day-to-day basis. And so this is, when we say day-to-day basis, this is chronically, consistently over time. So do they have healthy hair, skin, and nails? Is their weight being maintained appropriately over time, or are they growing appropriately over time? And we'll talk about that concept of growth in a little bit. Do they have good mood regulation? Do they, you know, certainly everyone gets frustrated at times and certainly everyone gets tired, but, you know, overall, do they seem to be able to regulate their mood adequately? Do they have good cognitive functioning? Do they have a healthy immune system? Or, you know, are they able to be resilient when they're exposed to lots of little colds? And or they, you know, the flip side of that would be, is this someone who's always getting sick and always seems to be susceptible to whatever is going around? Do they have energy for their training as well as just energy for day-to-day functioning? So maybe they can put in a hard 2-hour session for training, but then they're just depleted for the other 22 hours of the day. So looking at their energy levels, both on a day-to-day level as well as for their training. So looking at when athletes are not getting enough, right? And so there can be a lot of contributing factors that we'll look at for this. And I know that you had some discussion in a presentation on RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. It's a syndrome that refers to impaired physiological functioning caused by relative energy deficiency, and that can be considered to be synonymous with just not consuming enough calories to be, it sounds overly simplistic, but that's really what it comes down to. And it includes, but isn't limited to, impairment to metabolic rate, menstrual health, bone health, immunity, cardiovascular health, and protein synthesis, among many other functions. So this comes from a 2018 IOC, International Olympic Committee consensus paper. They came out with a consensus in 2014, and they provided an update in 2018. And this is a visual illustration of all the different body systems that are impacted when an athlete or individual is not consuming enough energy consistently over time, or, you know, if they're chronically underfueling their bodies. And so really there's no system that is not impacted through that chronic underconsumption. Sorry, okay. You'll see a little red triangle in there, and that illustrates the female athlete triad. And so the RED-S came out of the concept that the female athlete triad, which encapsulates insufficient energy intake, impaired bone health, and impaired menstrual function is too narrow of a focus to look at all the different ways in which an athlete's body is impacted by inadequate calorie consumption. And so the RED-S concept is more inclusive. It also allows for this to be applied to male athletes in addition to female athletes, unlike the female athlete triad. So thinking about RED-S, what are going to be some key factors that we're going to see as signs and symptoms of an athlete who might be underfueling or consuming insufficient energy? So I highlighted at the top there, some of the most common factors are going to be poor growth and chronic fatigue, or an athlete who's just tired all the time. Now, certainly there can be other contributors to chronic fatigue. Maybe they're iron deficient. And so a medical exam can help to rule out other causes. But here are some key signals that we see when someone is chronically underfueling. Now, what you see here is a growth chart, and the advantage that we have with our developing athletes, so an athlete under the age of 18, is that healthcare systems have done a pretty good job over the last few decades of tracking an individual's growth over time. And so what we like to see is not what growth chart they're in, but that they track in that growth chart consistently over time. Meaning if your child is in the 5th percentile, but they remain in the 5th percentile at age 2, age 5, age 10, et cetera, then that's appropriate growth. So it's less about where they fall in the growth chart and more that we want them to stay within that trajectory, stay trending in that growth chart over time. So here you see an athlete that was in the 50th percentile. I think this one's for height, and typically we would see a common trajectory for weight. And then let's say, right around age 13, we see that that athlete goes to the 25th percentile, to the 10th, to the 5th, and then they can't even track in the growth chart, which ranges from the 5th to the 95th percentile. And that illustrates a marked drop off their growth curve. And this is a great tool that our pediatricians have, or family providers, to show how our growth is tracking over time. And so for a developing athlete, it's a great assessment to see if growth has been adequate over time. So having that conversation with your medical provider can be a great resource. You see other indicators on the left there of inadequate energy intake. So specific nutrient deficiencies, iron deficiency is quite common in the context of RED-S, for example. Psychological stress and depression, and we'll see that later in signs of poor mood regulation as well, and increased irritability. Decreased muscle protein synthesis, hormonal and metabolic disturbances. We see increased stress hormones like the catecholamines and cortisol are going to be elevated in these individuals through the chronic energy restriction. And stress hormones really can wreak havoc on many systems in the body, as well as insufficient growth hormone production, which contributes to poor growth. So from a performance perspective, because I've worked with many 15-year-old athletes who may not care as much about their long-term bone development, and if we talk about the risk of osteoporosis when they're 60, I fully recognize that may not be relevant to us when we're an adolescent athlete. What I will say, though, is for the here and now, here are ways in which our inadequate intake can impact our performance now. So when we think about the impact on poor bone mineral density development, recognizing that females around age 20, males around age 19 reach peak bone mineral density. And so any form of chronic energy restriction can really compromise that bone growth. So sure, long-term increased risk for osteoporosis or low bone mineral density, but even right now, increases risk for stress fractures and other chronic injuries just due to the body's inability to recover and repair those injuries due to poor nutrition. Nutrition is such an integral part in our body's ability to recover and to work through injuries, right? So we see delayed recovery on a day-to-day basis from training, and then also impaired recovery from injury, as well as We talked about the role of nutrition for immune health. So these can be individuals who can be more susceptible to getting sick more often. They're more likely to be more irritable, have poor mood regulation, as well as poor cognitive functioning. And I know very few sports, I can't think of any sports that still don't require very acute cognitive functioning throughout the course of training and competition. And there's always strategy involved. And yet we know that when we study athletes, even in the context of, if we look at a 90-minute soccer game, they've studied athletes, and athletes who don't refuel mid-game, their decision-making when they're on the field is much poorer in the second half of the game, right? And so we don't want to be in the second half of our race and just have poor decision-making and poor cognitive functioning, and certainly decreased power and speed. So lots of performance impacts by insufficient fueling. So the underlying cause of RED-S really is just inadequate consumption of calories, of not consuming enough energy. And this comes from that consensus paper, which states that low energy availability or inadequate calories could be expected to impair performance or interfere with optimal performance gains via acute impairment of key processes such as glycogen storage or protein synthesis, or by preventing consistent and high quality training due to the increased risk of injury and illness. And so I think this highlights pretty well just some of the important impacts for athletes. So why does this happen? And previously, when prior to the RED-S, when really the only factor that was being studied was the female athlete triad, the one arm of the triad was an eating disorder. And we now recognize that an athlete can be under-fueling, under-consuming due to a myriad of reasons. It's not just due to an eating disorder or disordered eating. So it can be intentional, but it could also be a lack of knowledge of how much an athlete needs. An athlete might, you might be comparing yourself to your friend at lunchtime, and maybe your friend isn't an athlete and isn't as active as you are. And so what she eats at lunch may look very different. And so it can be natural to assume, well, that's how much you should be eating as well. And so sometimes it's just due to a lack of information and knowledge of how much you should be eating as an athlete. It can be related to busy schedules. Maybe you mean to eat a snack every day when you get home, but you end up dropping your bag off, getting changed, and running out the door without grabbing a snack. So busy schedules can be a reason why, as athletes, we're under fueling. Sometimes there can be, and we'll continue to talk about this concept, but an increased focus on nutrient density. And nutrient density simply refers to the amount of nutrients for a certain volume of food or measure of food. And so sometimes very nutrient dense foods can also be very high in fiber and maybe high in water. And so these foods can end up being very filling, but ultimately can be lower in calories. And so sometimes we see that athletes who focus on a very nutrient dense diet actually can be at risk of under consuming because of how filling those diets can be. And without sufficient more energy dense foods, healthy fats, for example, to offset that low energy intake, that can result in insufficient energy intake. And then also disordered eating. And again, this can be in the context, this could be taken to a clinical level of being a diagnosed eating disorder, but disordered eating is on a spectrum, can just include a myriad of behaviors that deviate from more normal eating and can put anyone at risk for insufficient intake. So it can be any mix really of all of those factors, and probably others as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the concept of orthorexia. I see this a lot and with athletes certainly, and we'll talk about some other cultural, societal factors that can increase pressures for orthorexia. It's not something that's as well understood or just, I find that not as many people are aware of this concept. And so I thought it'd be helpful to talk about it a little bit today. So orthorexia, as defined by the National Eating Disorders Association, is an obsession with proper or healthful eating. And it's not diagnosed as a clinical disorder, though it is recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It is included as a condition that exists, but it's not yet recognized to the degree of other diagnosed eating disorders like anorexia nervosa, for example. So I think sometimes the question that follows when we talk about orthorexia is, well, what's wrong with healthy eating, right? So my guess is that you've heard, or it's quite possible that you've heard many messages about how important it is as an athlete to adequately and properly fuel your bodies. And certainly as a sports dietitian, I would not undervalue the benefits of a nutrient-dense diet, right? So we know that diets that are plentiful in whole grains, fruits, vegetables, lean protein sources, healthy fats, milk or dairy alternatives, these are all going to provide our body with not only the energy and macronutrients that they need, but also all of the vitamins and minerals that our bodies need as well to fuel our training and for overall sense of health. It's orthorexia becomes problematic when it's taken to an unhealthy level. So when an individual doesn't just want to eat healthy, but they might become obsessed or fixated with the concept of healthy eating. Now, sometimes healthy eating can be well informed and they have a good sense of what healthy eating is. And sometimes an individual's sense of healthy eating might be coming from some misinformation. So there certainly can be some risks with that. But I just like to recognize that, you know, while certainly focusing on nutrient-dense diets, the great news is that as athletes, we have a lot of room in our nutritional approach to integrate foods that might be considered less healthful or more fun foods, as we might call them, because of our high energy expenditure. We are so active, you know, we have room in our diets, and all foods fit is a good message, I think, to think about here. So, you know, back to that question of, well, what's wrong with eating healthy? So here's, you know, a common roadmap that we can see with individuals who exhibit traits or tendencies toward orthorexia. So they might spend excessive time thinking and focusing on food. And there's actually really interesting psychological research that shows that the more we restrict our intake, the more time our brains spend thinking about food. And so sometimes just that concept of thinking about food all the time, that in of itself can be a red flag that we're actually not consuming enough. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it would make sense, right? So if our brains are hardwired to think about food when we're hungry, that would normally prompt us to seek out food. But in these instances, someone might be underfueling intentionally or not, but that can increase thoughts and fixation on food. We also know just as well from the research that psychological restriction of I shouldn't have something or I can't have something, or telling yourself that, you know, you shouldn't have ice cream or you shouldn't have desserts or you shouldn't have whatever X, Y, and Z it is, that naturally promotes us to want that food even more. So if we find ourselves just thinking about specific foods a lot, for example, that might be an indication that we're being a little restrictive with those types of foods. So that excessive time and focus on food can result in anxiety around food. That anxiety can promote individuals to avoid social situations that might include food because they're unsure what might be served, and about the anxiety of what it might be like to be in those social situations where they're faced with decisions that they'd have to make about food. That can increase risk for depression with that social isolation. That can result in insufficient nutrient and particularly energy intake, as we talked about, because of avoidance of social situations, avoidance of any sort of scenario where they might have to make decisions around food, as well as maybe sort of any elimination of certain foods that orthorexic thought pattern might be promoting. So avoid these foods, and eventually it can become quite restrictive and just limit the amount of nutrients and energy an individual consumes. And ultimately that results in poor health and performance outcomes, as we've seen. And athletes are at greater risk. So I mentioned this. And when we think about it, I think it makes sense, right? So athletes are inundated with messages of how important it is for them to take care of their bodies. And there can be a very large import placed on health and eating healthy. Athletes oftentimes have body composition goals and or body size, body shape, body weight goals that they might have that can promote this fixation on healthy eating. The messages that athletes, that you might be receiving about eating healthy, how that can fuel your performance can be taken to an unhealthy extreme as well. Athletes tend to have more perfectionism traits, and it's these traits that can help them to be high achieving athletes. And yet that trait of perfectionism can lend an individual towards a more all or nothing thinking approach, such as orthorexia. And normalized sport culture. So it's really interesting when I walk onto a field, if I'm doing a team talk, I can get a sense pretty early on about some of the concepts of that specific team's food culture. So if I come and it's halftime and I'm giving a talk, or it's after the game, what types of foods are the athletes eating? Are they even eating foods? What's being talked about with food? Where are the athletes going to go the night before a big race? And so there's a lot we can learn about a general sport culture, and then even within a team, their own sport culture. And I know a lot of sports organizations are doing a lot to shift that approach. The Olympic skier I was a roommate with, she talked about just how awful the culture was when she went to Italy, and just how the culture really promoted strong disordered eating behaviors. And now I know the sports dietitian here in Park City who works with US ski and snowboarding, and she works with Susie Parker-Simmons, who's worked with the team forever, and they've just made tremendous progress in trying to shift that culture of promoting very orthorexic and insufficient fueling strategies. So we can also look, especially as parents and as coaches, how can we promote a healthier food culture with our athletes? So the IOC consensus paper also had a really striking quote as well, and that is that the body of a young growing athlete often develops in a direction against the paradigm of the athlete's sport, especially in women, and where the sport demands being as lean as possible. And that certainly applies to Nordic skiing, right? So as athletes are developing, maturing, as you're growing, sometimes these developmental processes seem to go in opposite direction of pressures that might be real or perceived for what an athlete feels like where they should be in terms of their body type. And so if a very slender, lean, muscular body type is highly desirable, and maturation and growth and development is working against that, that can create a significant tension, and that can increase risk for disordered eating behaviors such as orthorexia, and even potentially development of clinical eating disorders. I think it's helpful to be aware of some warning signs that, that we can all be aware of when working with individuals. So here you see a list of warning signs that I think are helpful to look through. Just some questions that I ask athletes when I meet with them is, I might ask them, does eating unhealthy foods ever cause you stress or anxiety? Do you ever avoid social events because or going out with your friends because you're worried about the food that might be served there, or food decisions that you might have to make? If you went to a friend's house and they served you a meal of white pasta with sauce and garlic bread and no vegetables, would that cause anxiety for you? Would that be stressful for you? And so just thinking about what different scenarios, what sort of response that might elicit in an individual or not. And so that can give us an indication of how flexible an athlete can be. And I think flexibility really is key. So that's where we can see that tension coming in between wanting to eat healthy to fuel our bodies, and also recognizing that all foods can fit in our diet. Is, maybe most of our foods, and I'll talk about the 80-20 principle in a little bit, but most of our diet is comprised of healthful foods, of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, lean protein sources, healthy fats, good sources of calcium, vitamin D. and yet we can also go out and have a piece of pizza with our friend, or we can go out and have a cheeseburger or a milkshake, have something and still enjoy it, and recognize that we can have some flexibility with our dietary intake. So here's a pie chart of a way that we could conceptualize our life balance. And I'm going to ask Luke to chime in here as well. But I'll have my patients sometimes draw this pie chart. And what I'm asking them is to write down all different factors that they feel are important to their sense of life balance, right? So it might be hobbies, like maybe someone really enjoys art and drawing, and they really enjoy hanging out with their friends. They value their family. Certainly sport falls in there. There might be spiritual, religious priorities that are important for that individual, school. So, ideally, and it's impossible to say that everything is going to be equally proportioned, right? But do we allocate sufficient time and energy in our life to all the different areas in our life that are important? And what we can see in the cases of disordered eating, and even in instances of orthorexia, is that this can come out of balance, right? So maybe food is something that, takes up a large, a big majority of one's time and efforts and thought process, and a lot of their time is spent devoted to healthy eating and or regulating their body shape, their body size. And that just leaves so little time available for other areas of our life. Luke, is there anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think this information is so powerful, particularly from a mindset standpoint. And when we talk about mindset toughness and mindset training with athletes, we really talk a lot about balance, and there's a lot of layers to this. So I'll start with sort of one layer and then work into the next. And that is, when we talk about sort of the root of sports psychology and what it means to be mentally tough, we talk about energy control, and we talk about balancing our sympathetic with our parasympathetic nervous system. And there's ways we go about this, some techniques and tools that we share with athletes to create this more balanced and consistent state, not only within our athletic environments, but just throughout our everyday state. And it's so powerful to see from your presentation, the effect that food has on this, and the clear areas where we can see the imbalance coming out of, not eating enough calories, having those big mood swings, not being able to respond with some consistency to situations that require resilience, right? Having a tough race, having a bad day of training, those kinds of things require this sort of, this even keel. So balance is a big thing from the start. And then when we look at sort of the long-term trajectory of an athlete and being rightly rated or healthily related to sport over the long term, it really comes down to being able to have a balanced approach to it and not having all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, with sport and with result and with identity. And so this whole concept and this discussion about what we're taking in, how that's affecting our mood, how that's affecting our ability to respond to adversity, build resilience, and those things, it sort of compounds onto this bigger discussion about mental toughness and being a mentally tough athlete. So, I think that's at the core of our program with the Winter Sports Club, and one that I think we're just looking for more and more information, which you're presenting on here tonight. It's just fantastic to see.
Thank you. And thanks for helping to integrate this into a lot of what you guys are already doing. So thanks. All right. I think it's also important to address when might these disordered eating behaviors transition into more to a risk factors for more clinically diagnosed eating disorders. There is a lot of overlap that we see with athletes and risk for eating disorders, and athletes do have a higher risk of eating disorders and disordered eating than the non-athletic population. Rates are as high as 70% of athletes based upon the specific sport. And here are some increased risk factors beyond that. So again, that perfectionism and strong achievement orientation, which can support an athlete in being very successful in their sport, those same traits tend to result in more extreme nutrition behaviors as well. We see increased risk, and again, this is association, risk factors, certainly not cause and effect, but just increased risk of disordered eating and eating disorders when we see the early start of sport-specific training, as well as early competition. Any sort of dieting behaviors or weight loss that starts at an early age can increase risk. Desire to be lean and improve performance can increase risk for disordered eating behaviors, and then pressures from coaches and parents. And I should have a slide in here. I think it was in one of your presentations last fall that shows that, again, the number of individuals who will end up developing a diagnosed eating disorder might be much smaller, but there is a very large percentage of athletes that might fall in that subclinical range of disordered eating. And these are a lot of those traits that we tend to see that co-occur with these eating behaviors. Okay, here are some specific behaviors to watch for, because I think sometimes the focus on behaviors can be much easier than trying to understand mindset or trying to understand one's attitude towards food, for example. So here are some very specific behaviors that we can look at for eating disorders. So we talked about some specific behaviors with orthorexia. Here now are warning signs and other behaviors to be mindful of for disordered eating, which can progress if there's not an intervention, can progress to diagnosed eating disorders. So just some things that we can see. Certainly at the bottom, you see irritability, poor mood regulation, some of that social isolation that we've talked about, skipping meals, body checking a lot, checking their bodies a lot in the mirror, or asking questions about what people think about their bodies. Can also be concerning behaviors as well. So I think, what can we do as athletes and as parents and as coaches to help to promote a healthier food culture among our athletes and our teams? So just recognizing that all foods can fit into a healthy nutritional approach is a great starting point. Try not to label foods as good or bad. My daughters, it has been ingrained in them that the apple's not good and the carrot cake is not bad. I love carrot cake, so it can never be bad. But it's more just, we have our everyday foods and we have our sometimes foods. But when we apply that sort of moral judgment to, well, this food's good and that food's bad, it's that sort of morality that gets applied to food that can really start to promote more of a disordered eating mindset. And so in our family, it's everyday foods versus sometimes foods, but trying to shift away from that judgment that we can attribute to specific foods. Flexibility, right? So as we talked about, and towards the bottom, you see the 80-20 rule, and I think that's a great way to live out flexibility. And the 80-20 rule, it's fairly generalized, but it says that 80% of our nutritional intake, can come from our nutrient-dense food choices. So we should get about 80% of our calories from whole grains, fruits, vegetables, lean protein sources, healthy fats, dairy alternatives, for example. And that leaves about 20% room for more fun foods. And especially for athletes who have such a high energy need, that it gives them some flexibility with their food. And so, thinking of ways that we can include more of the fun foods into our daily consumption. For some people, they have a dessert every night after dinner. Some people, it's just throughout the day, they find little ways that they have something that they enjoy, but trying to integrate in a variety of foods and not just what we might deem to be the more nutrient-dense foods. I do ask these questions of what foods bring you enjoyment, what foods make you happy. I will say as a caveat though, for someone who is really in that mindset of orthorexia, they might say that the foods that make them happy and bring them enjoyment are the more nutrient-dense foods. And so sometimes that just takes some deeper work, working with a dietitian and working with a therapist, as we'll see for treatment recommendations. But in general, a lot of people can identify more of the fun foods that can be enjoyable and So how can those be foods that we can integrate more into our life if they're not as much of a part of our daily practice? As parents, some messaging that we can help to communicate to our children are focusing on food for energy, focusing on food for enjoyment instead of eating foods to lose weight or eating foods to achieve a specific body composition. So less of a focus on weight, body size, shape, and more of a focus on how food makes us feel, how it allows us to train when we want to train, allows us to study when we need to study. Food is something that we can enjoy with our friends, and so recognizing other functions that food can play in our lives. Avoiding discussions about body size and weight loss. And if you do have concerns, right? So sometimes a parent might have a concern about an athlete who they might have body composition concerns for their child, and it would be appropriate. My recommendation is that it would be appropriate to discuss that with your pediatrician or family medical provider, and consider working with a sports dietitian, if appropriate, to help to look at how can nutritional intake shift in a way that still supports a healthy relationship with food. And role modeling, there's so much to be said about the role of our own nutritional patterns and how that can impact the effect that it has on our children. I remember my daughters they're now 8 and 9, but they were 3 and 4 years old. And you have to recognize I work with patients with eating disorders, so I work with a very biased population. So it's my biggest concern is to develop a healthy relationship with food among my children. But I remember I had an athlete talking a lot about the ketogenic diet. This was a few years ago when it was still up and coming. And so, and then I had a colleague who was trying it, and she was like, "Kary, it's awful, but you should still try it, because if you're going to have these conversations with your athletes, you should know what it's like." And so I was trying to do the ketogenic diet. I remember sitting down, and my children were eating their potatoes and eating their broccoli and eating their, whatever they were eating. And I had just a very limited, my daughter was like, "Mom, why don't you have potatoes? And Mom, why don't you have this?" And I just realized how impactful my own role modeling was. And so I never tried the ketogenic diet, and that was just a personal choice, but I just value the role that I play as a role model for my children. And so I just opted not to have that sort of food restriction. But our own dieting behaviors or nutritional approach can have a strong impact on the nutritional approach of our children. Coaches, in general, not singling athletes out for their eating behaviors. It can be more impactful than we might realize. I've worked with many an athlete who have come to me and an offhanded comment that a coach might have made many years ago stuck with them and ended up, resulting in fairly unhealthy behaviors, right? So just being cognizant of how impactful any even side comment that we might make, the impact that can have on the athlete. So not to single athletes out for what they're eating, what they're not eating. We'll talk about some ways to approach concerns as well. But in general, if we have concerns about healthful eating patterns, approaching it as a team and not with individuals. Now, the caveat being, if you do have concerns about a specific individual, it could be appropriate to go to that individual's parent and suggest that, maybe it'd be helpful to meet with a sport dietitian or other provider, but for the coach themselves, not to single out that athlete. Just being aware of the signs and symptoms of low energy availability, referring to these slides, what are we going to see in these athletes who are under fueling and under consuming nutrients and calories? As coaches, promoting post-game nutrition, if it's a long training session, can you take a break in the middle of the session for fluids and fuel, and to encourage your athletes to bring snacks and fluids to all practices, and just making that part of your routine and part of your culture, which can help to develop a more positive food culture among your team. Referring to a sports dietitian when necessary, and even coaches role modeling. Oftentimes if we're being active with our athletes, then role modeling how are we fueling and feeding ourselves as well. Athletes who are identified to have low energy availability are recommended to see a dietitian if there doesn't seem to be any sort of disordered eating pattern going on. It's more just a or a cause of insufficient knowledge. If there does seem to be some disordered eating underlying factors, then working with a therapist as well, a medical provider. So there you see a treatment team approach to working with athletes that have disordered eating. So it would certainly be an appropriate next step. And I wanted to provide some additional practical recommendations for coaches and for you guys as athletes, if you have any concerns about peers as well. So certainly if we notice something and have concerns, the research is pretty consistent that the earlier we intervene and step in and try to provide help for someone, typically the better the outcomes. Of course, engaging in professional behavior and confidentiality. And then if we're going to approach someone, sometimes it's appropriate to maybe consider talking to the athlete's parents first, depending upon your relationship and trust that you have with that athlete. Looking at treatment if appropriate. And we talked about that multidisciplinary team. So for a coach, if you have a concern, I think it's what we tend to see is better received is if someone approaches an athlete with first starting with I statements of, I've just been concerned, I've noticed, here is where I'm coming from, and then focus on behaviors that you've noticed. I've noticed that you seem to be really sluggish when you come to practice every day, and I notice you have a hard time making it through the workouts. Or I noticed that, when everyone has a snack after practice, that you haven't been having one as well. I'm just wondering if you can talk to me about that. So just making observations about the behaviors that you have seen. Express concern, say, I'm worried that your body isn't getting the nutrients that it needs. Can I help with this? Can we help to connect you with some resources to help with this? Can we connect you with a dietitian? Can we connect you with, another healthcare professional that can help with this? And again, you may need to discuss this with the parents. If you're an athlete and you have concerns about a peer, maybe you have a friend and you notice that she just has been focusing on food a lot, that she has been avoiding the lunchroom at lunchtime, or hasn't been going out for team dinners, or other behaviors that you might be worried about. Again, using I statements, I've noticed, or here are some concerns that I've had. You can indicate the behaviors that you've observed. Like, I noticed you haven't been coming out with us for pizza night. Is there a reason why? Just say, I'm here if you need anything. I'd love to support you if I can, or at the very least, I can help connect you with our coach, or with, have this conversation with your parents, if you think that might be helpful. And then to bring that concern to a coach or to the parent if you're comfortable doing so. And what I see a lot of times is that if an athlete is approached by a peer, by a teammate, or by a coach, initially it's not uncommon to be a little defensive and to minimize what's going on, and to not want to talk about it in the moment. But just know that you have made yourself available as an ally and as a source of support, and they may feel comfortable going to you later, or at the very least, they have felt cared for, and that can be very hugely instrumental in them when they are willing and ready to seek out help. So these were just some strategies that I thought might be helpful to discuss. And then I did want to ask, are there any other scenarios that might be helpful to discuss? So this could, if Luke, if you want to chime in, and or if there are any other parents that have noticed any other scenarios that might be helpful to talk through.
Yeah, Kary, I had one question that I think comes up quite a bit, and we see it especially in season as we start to get into races and events and competitions with athletes that may have a quote unquote a bad race or an off day. And we talk a lot about what we attribute success and failure to within our program here at the club. And all too well, the power of attributing success and or failure to effort. over ability or talent. And it's a tough conversation sometimes, because I talk to coaches that say, I don't know that this athlete necessarily prepared correctly from either a sleep standpoint or a nutrition standpoint. So what kind of, advice would you have for coaches that may find themselves in a situation where they have an athlete, they suspect that, maybe something is not rising to the clinical level, but that they suspect that maybe nutrition is playing a big part in their performance, or in their inability to perform at the right time. So how would you kind of guide coaches through that conversation?
Yeah, and I think only if you do an in-depth analysis of that individual's intake can you really get an idea if they are adequately fueling, and if they are getting the nutrients that their body needs, as well as getting a sense of what that food relationship might look like. And so I would just see if that athlete and their family are willing to consider working with a sports dietitian to see, can they rule out maybe some behaviors that might be impacting their performance, impacting their recovery or not, right? So to not overinflate the role of nutrition as well. And so I think that's where having a more in-depth assessment by a professional can be helpful, because it can, I would imagine it'd be really challenging for a coach to really have a sense of, is an athlete getting what they need specifically, but certainly they can identify risk factors, right? And indications of inadequate intake. So I would, in that case, refer on to a professional dietitian for an assessment. Let's see, I want to try to monitor the chat and the Q&A. So, so there was a question about, what about the scenario when the child is eating a balanced intake, has a healthy relationship with food, and is sleeping consistently, and yet still observe lower energy levels? I would suspect in that case, the most likely candidate tends to be iron deficiency, though there could be B12 or, other nutrient deficiencies as well. And so I would start with your pediatrician or family medical provider and do, some basic blood work, but you would also want to request a serum ferritin level, because that's not typically included in the basic metabolic panel, but serum ferritin is a more sensitive measure of iron status. And so I would specifically request that. I see Mark's question about an alpine athlete looking to build weight, strength, and muscle mass. And so I'm going to, at the very end, Mark, please circle back with me on that, because I would love to give maybe some quick little pointers, but I do want to make sure that we look at, first tie together what we're talking about in the context of low energy intake, because certainly for athletes trying to increase muscle mass and build strength, that can be equally present its own challenges as well. All right. Oh, and then I do see a question about recent years, Scandinavian countries have benched some of their top stars due to health concerns related to red S. I don't know what their measures are. So that is a great segue. So I will right now quickly transition to some resources that we have as coaches, as parents, athletes. You're certainly welcome to look at these as well, to know how do we identify athletes at risk, and when is it appropriate for them to be participating in sport versus not. So there are some screening tools that we have. First, I'll actually skip this one and look at, here's a paper I sent to Dave just today, and it's an IOC working group that looked at how to minimize the health risks for athletes who compete in weight sensitive sports. And you'll see they have on the top left there, no start criteria. So these are athletes who should not be participating in play or in sport, not just competition, but training. And then on the right, you see alarm criteria. So certainly warrants additional feedback from a healthcare team. So a medical provider, potentially a psychologist, and a sports dietitian. And so here you see some of the behaviors that they're going to be screening for. It's going to highlight risks of low bone mineral density, as well as amenorrhea, lack of menses. and doing a dietary analysis. And what's been really helpful as a sports dietitian is, I will say, we now have better, though not perfect, tools for assessing how much an athlete needs to be consuming specific to energy deficiency. And so when I meet with an athlete, I get a very rough estimate of their body composition. And so I calculate their fat-free body mass, and I'm able to compute what is their energy availability. So how many calories are available to their body after the energy cost of sport is subtracted from their intake. And we know that athletes, we want them to be at around 40 to 45 calories per kilogram of fat-free body mass. And any athlete that's below 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free body mass is at risk. And some of this terminology, I understand, is a little confusing. Just recognize that professionals like sports dietitians, sport medicine providers are able to do a pretty thorough risk assessment and are able to inform if an athlete should be taking some time off and focusing on their energy intake, or if it's appropriate for them to continue participation in sport. In the previous slide, is a return to play, that form that is specific for the female athlete triad, so would be appropriate for female athletes, but that sport medicine providers are encouraged to utilize in that decision making of, does this athlete have specific risk factors? So there are actual and sort of objective and specific behaviors and medical signs and symptoms that we can watch for to identify risk of low energy availability. Okay, I realize this is an overly simplistic slide here, but so what comes next? So culturally, how can we continue to promote the enjoyment of food? Just being aware of the signs and symptoms of relative energy deficiency in sport and orthorexia and eating disorders, and referring on to specialists when there are concerns. I like to show these visuals very quickly for athletes out there because, I know I showed those sample meal plans at the very beginning that illustrated what you should be eating. Just know that even with our Olympic athletes, these are visual aids that we use in the Olympic Training Center to say, okay, it's mealtime, what should your plate look like? And sometimes keeping it simpler versus more complicated can be a strategy for decreasing some of that anxiety around food. So if it's a medium training day, and I think that's what you're heading into in May, is more moderate training volume, and Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, but think about a third, maybe a quarter to a third of your plate comes from protein sources, and then the remaining sections on your plate are divided by the fruits and vegetables and the whole grains. And then on hard training or higher volume training days, half your plate should be comprised of the complex carbohydrates, the starches, the whole grains, because those are your most important source of energy. And then the other half would be divided by fruits, vegetables, and protein sources. And we see, addition of fat in there for flavor, as well as, fluid options and having a fruit or a vegetable in there. So it just illustrates sometimes, even from a more simple standpoint, how can we structure our plates to make sure we're getting enough, and looking at the portion sizes on our plates of the whole grains, the fruits, vegetables, and the protein sources can be very helpful. All right, so here are some local resources that Dave helped to send to me that are in the Steamboat as well as Denver area. And I think you are all familiar with Kara Mars and some other, Dr. Lori Kreider, I think, is a local clinical psychologist. And then there are some resources in Denver as well. Here's my contact information if you do have any questions. And then as I open up time for questions, I, at the last minute, decided to add this slide in because we talk a lot about helping to develop a healthy relationship with food, right? And so that begs the question, well, what is normal eating, right? With the premise that normal eating helps to illustrate having a healthy relationship with food. I realize that's a big jump to make. But I really like this quote from Ellen Satter. She's an expert in pediatric and adult nutrition, dietitian, and talks about how to raise healthy, intuitive eaters. And I think this is just a great quote that really can capture what normal eating looks like. Or at least this is what I resonate with this quote as well. So as you're reading through this, I welcome any other questions that you might have. Oh, and I see a question here, and I'll try to go back. I realize there are previous questions too that I missed, but Josh asked, can you speak to the short-term improvements that athletes will see from weight loss versus long-term negative effect that may not be maintained or hurt them in the long run? Absolutely. So it's such a great point, and it's something that as sports dietitians, you know, I at least from the curriculum that we use in our program and what I've seen, there's been an increased focus of realizing that there may be specific body types that seem to do well in specific sports, right? So we all might have an image of what a successful gymnast is going to look like versus a successful Nordic skier is going to look like versus a successful strength power athlete. And yet to recognize that our genetics and other factors are going to have a huge impact on what our body size and even composition actually will end up looking like. And so when we think of what it can take to try and achieve a specific body type or body composition, the means by which we would have to achieve that specific body composition is going to probably have far worse performance benefits than actually achieving that body composition. So let's say, for an example, we have an athlete who I'm using very theoretical concept. Maybe it's a female athlete, she's 140 pounds, and she believes that if she were 120 pounds, she would be a much faster racer. And yet for her to lose that 20 pounds, for her, that would require a significant energy restriction and significant reduction in nutrient intake. And the effects of restricting their intake is going to have a much worse effect on performance than what they might, any benefit they would see by being 120 pounds, right? And so there has to be this cost benefit analysis of looking at, you know, what benefits might an athlete get by changes in their body composition, but then the means by which they achieve those changes can have a worse impact on their performance. And really to make those decisions, I recommend working with a professional. They can do some somatotyping, they can do some body composition assessment, and just looking at overall intake, and we can recognize when is it appropriate to consider maybe some minor tweaks and changes, and when is it not. And I will say with developing athletes, we tend not to recommend weight loss as a general rule of thumb because we don't want to compromise their growth, but there can be nuances to that. And so that's where working with a professional is really important. And then the follow-up question of dietitians using blood tests to determine food sensitivities that can label certain foods as bad. And there really is not strong evidence to support that a lot of these blood tests are effective at identifying what foods someone should be avoiding. So someone may have a sensitivity to a specific food. It doesn't actually mean that they're going to react to it. And so it can cause unnecessary restrictions. I mean, I've seen people come to me with blood work that shows 50 foods that they're supposed to be eliminating from their diet, and yet they were consuming all 50 of these foods just fine without any adverse effects. And so really the gold standard is a placebo, a double-blind study that uses the skin prick test and an oral food challenge that's done by an allergist. And so if you have concerns about food allergies, I would go see a medical professional. The blood tests themselves tend not to be accurate and don't have a lot of science behind them. Were there any other questions that I missed, though?
I believe Cedar Beauregard raised his hand earlier with a question, and I just had unmuted him, but now I don't see him.
Well,
may
and
have missed my opportunity. Yep.
Oh, well, I can quickly, mention Mark's question about alpine athletes looking to build weight, strength, and muscle mass. And, I will say, I've certainly worked with the adolescent athlete who naturally is a very lean and might have a more slender frame, and they're participating in a sport where there might be performance pressures to increase their lean body mass, such as alpine skiers. And I'm biased. Certainly, I would also recommend working with a professional in that context as well, though, because sometimes when it's pushed on an athlete in a way that can increase stress and anxiety if they're not achieving these outcomes, it can be challenging as well. We know that trying to just in the context of weight loss, we also don't want to impair performance by excessive intake beyond what would be helpful in promoting strength gains. So figuring out what that, balance is, but increasing overall intake from a variety of macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Protein, yes, but also carbohydrate and healthy fats as well. And eating more frequently throughout the day are sort of generalized strategies. And then, for more specific individualized recommendations, working with a dietitian based upon your athlete's regular dietary intake can be helpful. And Dave, you have here, if it's helpful, I'll go back to that slide, and then you're welcome to disseminate these slides. And here's my contact information. I'm happy to answer any general questions that you have. And it looks like you have some great resources in the Steamboat and Denver area as well, which is awesome. So I just think the fact that your club is prioritizing this topic speaks very highly to the importance that you place on developing a healthy food culture with your athletes. Oh,
Yeah,
question on supplementation.
Yeah, go ahead. Get that one.
Yeah, so I suppose it depends on supplementation for what, in terms of supplements for weight gain, general protein supplements can be a convenient source of increasing protein intake, but it doesn't need to be with protein supplements. Food sources can be just and sometimes more effective in terms of providing more nutrients. But there is a convenience factor. I'm not going to, it's out of the context to get into supplements like creatine and other weight gain supplements. I'm going to, just for today, defer some of those questions. Supplements for weight loss across the board, I'm going to recommend avoiding supplements for weight loss. In general, the sport nutrition literature has really only a handful of dietary supplements that have shown to be effective and have even a small ergogenic benefit, meaning a performance enhancing benefit. There's not a lot that is going to have a significant benefit, and rather an athlete is going to see much greater benefit and performance gains from focusing on a healthy, well-balanced diet than they are with any one specific supplement. So, at a later time, if you want to talk supplements, we could have a conversation about that. But in general, I tend to take more of a food first, supplement second approach. Oh, iron, multivitamin C, magnesium. Yeah, so if an athlete is consuming a pretty balanced diet, like the athlete's plate that we looked at, they're probably not at risk of any nutrient deficiencies. The one exception being vitamin D. So winter sport athletes tend to be at greater risk for vitamin D deficiency, but instead of defaulting to vitamin D supplementation, I first would recommend getting a blood test, pretty quick and easy, and is the most commonly requested serum assay worldwide, and is helpful to check levels before supplementing, because just because someone's good, more is not necessarily better. So if an athlete is in the sufficient range, they're not going to get any added benefit from supplementation. And so getting levels checked first. And if you are concerned, getting levels checked in the winter months would be more indicative versus summer months, because if we're out and we're less likely to be deficient in the summer because we get more vitamin D from the sun. Iron athletes who are vegetarian or vegan are at higher risk of iron deficiency, though certainly it's not a foregone conclusion. A varied diet that includes iron-rich plant foods can provide sufficient iron. So it really just depends on the individual, but most other diets that include animal foods, and especially meat, tend to be sufficient in iron. So it would be another one that I would recommend getting tested, because excessive intake can actually impede our body's response and recovery to exercise. And so excessive iron can be pro-inflammatory, and so and increases oxidation in the body. So we don't want to supplement with it unless we need it, and a simple blood test. But that's where I do recommend the serum ferritin as a more sensitive measure of iron status if you have any concerns. So athletes who are severely cutting calories or vegetarian or vegan would just be higher risk of, and could be helpful to get screened. And then again, multivitamin, not necessary unless that an athlete's diet is not very well balanced and is not very nutrient dense, in which case taking a children's multivite can be an appropriate backup. Did I get every other question?
Kary, one question. Just wanted to follow up on that. To follow up on the question that Josh asked earlier, that the difference between that sort of short term and the long term. I think in some, in weight bearing, strength to weight ratio sports, cross country, Nordic combined, ski jumping, there can be that short, that 1 month, even 1 year, even potentially longer benefit from an unhealthy loss of weight. And I think that can be reinforcing, right, to that behavior. I think
Yep.
that's something that I've seen, right, where an athlete does lose some weight and they see that performance gain. Can you talk a little bit about what are those long-term mechanisms that are leading to why that's not sustainable, and what they're not experiencing in that moment with those performance gains that's going to have those long-term negative health and performance impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I appreciate you recognizing that it can be really reinforcing in the short term when someone might engage in a very restrictive or restrictive intake or a fad diet, or some sort of approach that really reduces their intake and results in that short term body weight loss. And it can be reinforcing in the sense of feedback from peers and other people of, wow, you look great, or, that verbal feedback, as well as some short-term performance gains that athletes might see. But it always ends up catching up to the individual if they continue to engage in those behaviors. So over time, everyone's body is different, but over time, the body's iron stores are going to become depleted, and other nutrient stores are going to become depleted, and that is going to impair immune function. That is going to impair the athlete's ability to recover. It's going to be harder and harder to engage in that higher volume, higher intensity training. They are going to start to see decreases in their strength output, sometimes decreases in their sprinting abilities, and then decreases in their endurance. And what's happening is, when the body's in a severely restricted state, it's breaking itself down, and our bodies are not able to differentiate. For example, it doesn't say, well, I'm going to break down my arm muscle before I break down my internal organ muscle, right? Because even our internal organs are comprised of muscle. Our heart is a muscle. And so our body just starts to breaking down protein, as well as other nutrients or other body tissue in order to try and keep itself alive. Another effect is that our metabolism slows down, and that's the body trying to be really efficient. And so, and anyone who wants to maintain, healthy metabolism might recognize that we don't want our metabolism to be slow. And so what that means is that all of a sudden now, what someone previously maybe needed 2,000 calories to maintain their weight, now they only need 1,500 calories, and it ends up becoming this progressive cycle of a lower and lower intake that is needed. And so we see a significantly decreased metabolic rate in these individuals. And it's inevitable that this is going to impact bone health, it's going to impact menstrual health, cardiovascular health. And an athlete might say, well, I'm fine, or at least I'm performing well, until all of a sudden they're not. We've seen many instances where athletes experience either very acute injuries related to malnutrition and chronic underfueling, stress fractures, other injuries that just take them out of their sport and training. And so it can be a slow progression of minimizing the effects, or a pretty rapid onset of an injury. But eventually it does end up catching up to the individual. And it as we saw with that red illustration, it ends up affecting every system in the body. It can just take such a long time for an athlete to recover from that. And most outcomes we can recover. So I don't want to be all, I think it's important to recognize that almost all of these effects can be reversed through adequate nutrition, but the longer it goes unnoticed and untreated, the longer we see that it takes to restore that sense of health and those functions.
Great, thank you, Kary. Well, I'm not sure if there are any more questions. If there are, you can certainly raise a hand or type it into the question and answer or chat function. But I just know that as an athlete, having teammates who struggled with energy imbalance or eating disorders, and as a coach working with athletes who did, this information is certainly a foundation that I wish I had at that time. So very valuable for our athletes, coaches, parents to be up to speed and know how to support healthy behaviors for long-term health and for performance. So thanks a lot, Kary and Luke.
Thanks, Kary. This was fantastic.
Yeah, no, happy to do it.
Well, I don't see any new ones popping up. I see a couple of thank yous coming through there. I just want to reiterate that. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with the Winter Sports Club and sharing your time this evening, Kary and Luke. Very much appreciate it. And for anyone out there, this has been recorded and we can share this tomorrow along with the slides and the papers that Kary mentioned as well. All right. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dave and Luke. I appreciate the opportunity. It was fun.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kary.